My name is Amanda Richardson, and last Thursday my husband told me I was worthless and would never amount to anything without him. What he did not know was that 24 hours earlier, I had inherited $67 million from my grandmother's estate. My hands were still shaking from reading the lawyer's letter when Marcus delivered his cruel words. But instead of breaking me, his cruelty gave me the clarity I needed. If you are watching this right now, drop a comment letting me know where you are viewing from. Before I tell you about how I discovered who my husband really was, hit like and subscribe to hear more real stories about marriage, betrayal, and the power of keeping secrets that might just change how you see your own relationships. For 8 years, I had been married to Marcus Richardson, a man who slowly convinced me that I was lucky to have him. I was 31 years old, working as a part-time administrative assistant at a small law firm in Portland, barely making enough to contribute meaningfully to our household expenses. Marcus constantly reminded me of this fact. He worked as a sales manager at a car dealership and made decent money, though never as much as he claimed to potential customers or friends at dinner parties. More importantly, he never let me forget that his income was what kept us afloat financially. Our marriage had started so differently from where it ended up. When we first met 9 years ago at a coffee shop near downtown Portland, Marcus was charming, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts and dreams. I was working full-time then as a paralegal at a respected law firm and felt confident about my career prospects and my future. Marcus was working at a smaller dealership then, ambitious and full of plans for advancement. We talked for hours about our goals, our families, and what we wanted from life. But gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, things began to shift in our relationship. It started with small suggestions that seemed caring and thoughtful. Marcus would point out that I looked tired after long days at work, suggesting that maybe I was pushing myself too hard. He would offer to handle tasks I was working on, claiming he had more experience or could do them more efficiently. When I expressed interest in taking evening classes to advance my paralegal credentials, he gently discouraged me by pointing out the cost and questioning whether the time commitment was really worth the uncertain benefits. The changes were so subtle and presented with such apparent concern for my well-being that I did not recognize them as manipulation until years later. Marcus began undermining my confidence in ways so gradual I barely noticed at first. He would make small comments about my appearance, suggesting I might want to try a different hairstyle or maybe invest in some new clothes that would be more flattering. He questioned my ability to handle complex legal research, often interrupting my work to offer corrections or improvements that were not actually necessary. When we got married after 2 years of dating, I was still working full-time, but Marcus had convinced me that once we started a family, it would make more sense for me to work part-time so I could focus on home responsibilities. The family never materialized due to what doctors eventually diagnosed as fertility issues. But by then, I had already reduced my work hours and found myself financially dependent on Marcus in ways I had never planned or wanted. My family situation made it easier for Marcus to gradually isolate me from potential support systems. My parents, Robert and Linda Morrison, had divorced when I was in college, and both had quickly remarried and started new lives that seemed to have little room for their adult daughter. The divorce had been bitter and expensive, leaving both of them financially strained and emotionally exhausted. My father moved to Seattle with his new wife, Patricia, and their twin sons, establishing a life that revolved around his new family's needs and activities. My mother had relocated to Phoenix with her second husband, David, a retired military officer who had strong opinions about family loyalty and respect for authority. David had made it clear from the beginning that he considered my mother's previous family to be part of her past, not their shared future together. When I called my mother to discuss problems in my marriage or career frustrations, she would listen politely, but usually ended conversations by reminding me that marriage required compromise and that I should be grateful to have a stable relationship. The one constant source of love and wisdom in my family had been my paternal grandmother, Eleanor Richardson. She was 87 years old, sharp as a blade, and lived independently in the same beautiful Victorian house where she had raised my father and his 3 siblings. Grandma Eleanor had always been special to me, and I was the only grandchild who visited her regularly, helped with grocery shopping and household tasks, and genuinely enjoyed spending time listening to her stories and seeking her advice. Marcus tolerated these weekly visits but often complained that I spent too much time and emotional energy on an old woman who was probably not going to live much longer anyway. He would make pointed comments about how I rushed to help my grandmother with trivial problems while neglecting responsibilities at home. When Grandma Eleanor would call me for help with technology issues or to ask me to drive her to doctor appointments, Marcus would sigh heavily and make remarks about how demanding elderly people could become. What Marcus never understood, and what I had never fully appreciated until it was almost too late, was that Grandma Eleanor had been watching our marriage very carefully over the years. During my Sunday afternoon visits, she would ask gentle but probing questions about my happiness, my goals, and my relationship with Marcus. When I made excuses for his critical comments or downplayed incidents that left me feeling small and inadequate, I could see growing concern in her intelligent blue eyes. Grandma Eleanor had an uncanny ability to see through people's facades and understand their true motivations. She had been married to my grandfather for 52 years before he died, and she often told me that a good marriage should make both people feel stronger and more capable, not smaller and more dependent. When I would mention Marcus's helpful corrections of my work or his practical suggestions about my appearance, she would nod thoughtfully but ask follow-up questions that made me think more deeply about his motivations. 3 months ago, during one of our regular Sunday visits, Grandma Eleanor asked me a question that completely caught me off guard. We were sitting in her sunny kitchen, sharing tea and homemade cookies, when she looked directly at me and said, "Amanda, sweetheart, are you truly happy in your marriage? Not content, not managing, but genuinely happy?" I had started to give her my usual reassuring response about how marriage was always work and Marcus was a good provider. Something in her expression stopped me mid-sentence. Instead, I found myself telling her the truth about how lonely I felt in my own home, how small Marcus made me feel on a daily basis, and how I had begun to believe that maybe I really was not capable of handling much responsibility or making important decisions independently. She listened without interrupting as I described the constant criticism disguised as helpful suggestions, the way Marcus dismissed my opinions during conversations with other people, and how he had gradually convinced me that I was fortunate to have someone willing to take care of someone as incompetent as me. When I finished talking, Grandma Eleanor took my hands in her weathered but strong ones and spoke words I will never forget. "Sweet Amanda," she said with quiet intensity, "that man has been systematically destroying your confidence and sense of self-worth. And you have been letting him do it because he is clever enough to disguise his cruelty as concern. You were bright, ambitious, and full of potential when you first brought him to meet me 9 years ago. Now you apologize for having opinions and ask permission to visit your own grandmother." Her words stung because they were absolutely true. But they also planted a seed of awareness that had been growing steadily ever since that conversation. I began paying closer attention to how Marcus spoke to me, how he dismissed my thoughts and ideas, and how he had gradually convinced me that I was dependent on him for everything important in my life, from financial security to social connections, to basic decision-making. 2 weeks ago, I received a phone call that changed my entire world. Grandma Eleanor had suffered a massive heart attack during the night and died peacefully in her sleep. I was completely devastated, not just because I had lost the most important person in my life, but because I realized I had lost my only reliable source of unconditional love and genuine support. The funeral was scheduled for the following Thursday, and I spent the intervening days in a fog of grief and disorientation. Marcus showed up to the funeral, but made it clear he considered it an inconvenience. He spent most of the service checking his phone for work messages and complained about having to take time off during a busy sales period. When people approached me to share memories of my grandmother or offer condolences, Marcus would interrupt conversations to mention our parking meter was expiring or that we needed to leave soon to avoid traffic. After the service, the family gathered at Grandma Eleanor's house for the traditional meal and remembrance sharing. As people told stories about her kindness, wisdom, and quiet generosity, Marcus made several comments that embarrassed and hurt me deeply. When my cousin Jennifer mentioned how much Grandma Eleanor had treasured my weekly visits and how often she talked about my intelligence and potential, Marcus said loudly, "Yeah, Kate Tix spent more time here than at our own house sometimes. Good thing the old lady is not around anymore to monopolize her time and attention." The room fell silent, and I felt my face burning with shame and anger. Not shame for caring about my grandmother, but shame that I was married to someone who could be so cruel and thoughtless at a funeral. That was the precise moment I began to understand what Grandma Eleanor had been trying to tell me during our conversations over the past few months. The problem was not me being too sensitive or demanding. The problem was that I was married to someone who lacked basic empathy and respect for other people. The morning after the funeral, I received a call from Henry Morrison, my grandmother's longtime attorney. He asked if I could come to his office that afternoon for the reading of her will. I assumed this would be a simple formality, that her modest house and personal belongings would be distributed among her children and grandchildren. According to some standard legal arrangement, Grandma Eleanor had lived simply, drove an older car, and clipped coupons. So I expected the estate to be comfortable but not substantial. Marcus insisted on accompanying me to the lawyer's office, claiming he needed to understand any changes to our family's financial situation. He had been unusually attentive since the funeral, asking questions about my grandmother's house and weather. I thought it might be worth selling quickly. Mr. Morrison seemed surprised to see Marcus but did not object to his presence in the conference room. As we sat in the small but elegant office overlooking downtown Portland, Mr. Morrison opened a thick leather folder and began reading the legal document that would change my life forever. The first few bequests were exactly what I had expected. Small amounts of money to various charities my grandmother had supported over the years, personal items distributed among family members, and modest cash gifts of a few $1,000s each to my father and his siblings. Then Mr. Morrison came to a section that made my heart stop beating entirely. To my beloved granddaughter, Amanda Richardson, who has shown me more genuine love, respect, and devotion than anyone else in my family, I leave the entirety of my remaining estate. This includes all real estate properties, investment portfolios, business holdings, and liquid assets, currently valued at approximately $67 million. The room went completely silent except for the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Marcus's mouth actually fell open and his face went pale. I sat there completely unable to process what I had just heard. $67 million. My sweet, frugal grandmother, who used coupons and drove a 15-year-old Honda Accord, had been worth $67 million. Mr. Morrison continued reading details from the will, but I could barely focus on his words through my shock and disbelief. Something about real estate investments made decades ago that had appreciated dramatically, stock portfolios that had grown exponentially over time, and a partnership in a successful business that had been generating steady income for over 30 years. Grandma Eleanor had lived modestly by choice, not necessity, and had been quietly accumulating wealth, while maintaining the lifestyle of a comfortable but not wealthy retiree. The meeting lasted another 2 hours, with Mr. Morrison explaining the legal procedures for transferring assets, tax implications I would need to understand, and the timeline for gaining full access to various accounts and properties. Marcus sat in stunned silence throughout most of this discussion, occasionally asking questions about how quickly money would become available and what kinds of investment returns I could expect. I signed numerous documents and tried to absorb the staggering reality that I was now worth more money than I had ever imagined could exist in one place. Mr. Morrison assured me that everything had been structured to minimize tax obligations and maximize my control over the inheritance. There were no restrictions, no conditions I had to meet, and no requirements to consult with anyone else about financial decisions. During the drive home, Marcus was uncharacteristically quiet for the first 10 minutes. Then he started talking, and I realized he had been calculating rather than processing emotions. "Well," he said in a voice that was trying to sound casual, "this obviously changes our situation pretty dramatically. We are going to need to sit down tonight and make some serious plans about how to handle this kind of wealth responsibly." He continued talking about immediate priorities like buying a larger house in a better neighborhood, perhaps that gated community we had looked at the previous year. It's mentioned that he had always wanted to start his own car dealership, and this inheritance could provide the seed capital he needed to become an entrepreneur instead of an employee. He talked about investment strategies, tax planning, and the importance of not letting sudden wealth change our fundamental values and priorities. As I listened to him make plans for money that legally belonged entirely to me, I realized that, in his mind, my inheritance had automatically become our inheritance. He was already making assumptions about major financial decisions without asking what I wanted to do or how. I felt about suddenly having such enormous wealth and responsibility. That was the moment I decided to conduct my own test of his character and motivations. When we arrived home, I told Marcus I needed some time alone to process everything that had happened and asked if he could give me space that evening to think and grieve privately. He reluctantly agreed, but spent the next several hours making phone calls to friends and business associates, presumably sharing news about our sudden change in fortune. I could hear him in the other room describing real estate possibilities and business opportunities, as if he had inherited the money himself. That night, I lay awake thinking about Grandma Eleanor's final gift to me. It was not just money, though. The financial security was certainly life-changing. It was freedom. Freedom from dependence on Marcus for basic survival. Freedom to discover who I really was without his constant criticism and control. And freedom to build a life based on my own values and choices rather than his approval and direction. But first, wanted to understand exactly what kind of man I had been married to for 8 years. I suspected that Marcus's interest in me was primarily practical rather than emotional, but I had never been in a position to test that theory. Now I had the perfect opportunity to see how he would treat me, if he believed the money was not going to benefit him personally. The next morning, I made a decision that would reveal Marcus's true character more clearly than I could have imagined. I told him that after speaking privately with Mr. Morrison, I had discovered there were serious complications with the inheritance that had not been discussed in his presence. The estate was being contested by other family members, I explained. The assets were tied up in complex legal proceedings, and it could be months or even years before I would actually receive any money. Marcus's reaction was swift and telling. "What do you mean contested?" he demanded. "Who exactly is contesting it, and on what grounds? This is completely ridiculous. We need that money available now, not tied up in some lengthy legal battle with people who probably have no legitimate claim to it anyway," I explained, using what I hoped were convincing details that some of my father's siblings were claiming. The will was invalid because they believed Grandma Eleanor had not been mentally competent when she made her recent changes to the estate plan. I told him that several lawyers had advised the family to expect a protracted legal battle that could consume much of the inheritance in legal fees and court costs. His disappointment was immediate and obvious. But what happened over the following month? Days revealed the true depth of his selfishness and contempt for me as a person. Marcus became increasingly resentful and critical, making comments about how typical it was that I would inherit money only to lose it through legal incompetence and poor family management. He suggested that I had probably misunderstood the lawyer's explanations, and that the inheritance had never been as substantial as I had claimed. But what came next was far worse than disappointment or criticism. Marcus began treating me with open contempt, as if my failure to secure the inheritance proved everything he had always believed about my incompetence and worthlessness. He stopped making any effort to hide his frustration with me, and his cruel comments became more frequent and more personal. The breaking point came on Thursday evening, exactly 1 week after that life-changing meeting in the lawyer's office. I had prepared a simple dinner of pasta and salad, nothing fancy but made with care. I was trying to make normal conversation about work and everyday topics, hoping to maintain some semblance of our usual routine despite the tension that had been building between us all week. Marcus had been drinking wine with dinner, which always made his criticism sharper and his contempt for me more obvious. He started by complaining about his day at work, how difficult customers had been, and how frustrated he was with his sales manager's unrealistic expectations. Then he turned his attention to me, and what he said next revealed exactly who he really was beneath the facade he had maintained for so many years. "Amanda," he said, looking at me with undisguised disgust, "you are absolutely pathetic. You had one opportunity, one single chance to actually contribute something meaningful to this marriage, and you managed to screw it up through sheer incompetence and poor judgment. I should have known better than to expect anything different from you." He continued his verbal assault while I sat there absorbing every cruel word. "You are worthless, completely worthless as a partner and as a human being. You cannot handle a real job with meaningful responsibilities. You cannot manage money or legal situations. You cannot even inherit wealth properly when it is handed to you on a silver platter. I have wasted 8 years of my life carrying dead weight, supporting someone who contributes nothing positive and never will contribute anything of value." As he spoke, his voice getting louder and more vicious with each sentence, something fundamental shifted inside me permanently. This was not anger or frustration talking. This was his true assessment of me as a person, delivered without filters or pretense when he thought there was no longer any benefit to maintaining a kind facade. In his mind, I had value only when I could provide something he wanted. And without that financial benefit, I was worse than useless to him. "But you know what the real problem is?" he continued, leaning back in his chair with a cruel smile. "You are exactly like your pathetic family. Your father abandoned you when you became inconvenient. Your mother chose a new husband over maintaining a relationship with you. And even your precious grandmother left you money you are too stupid and incompetent to actually collect. Nobody wants you around because you drag everyone down to your level of mediocrity and failure." His words were designed to destroy me completely, to convince me that I was truly alone in the world and dependent on his tolerance for survival. But instead of feeling crushed, felt something I had not experienced in years: clarity, perfect, crystal clear understanding of who Marcus really was and what our marriage had always meant to him. The next morning, Marcus left for work as usual, still muttering about my incompetence and how the inheritance situation proved everything he had always suspected about my abilities and character. After his car disappeared down our street, I sat in our kitchen drinking coffee and planning the most important day of my life. Mr. Morrison and scheduled a private meeting for that afternoon. It was time to understand exactly what I had inherited and to make some crucial decisions about my future that would not involve consulting with Marcus about anything. I also called in sick to my part-time job, claiming a family emergency that required my immediate attention. Mr. Morrison's office felt completely different when I returned there alone. Instead of feeling like an outsider who was visiting by accident, I felt like someone who belonged. Someone who had the right to be there making important decisions about significant money. He spread out detailed financial statements, property, deeds, and investment portfolios that showed the true scope of my grandmother's wealth and business acumen. The $67 million figure had actually been conservative. calculated at the time the will was written 18 months earlier. With recent market growth and property appreciation, the estate was now worth closer to $74 million. More importantly, everything was structured to give me complete autonomy and control. There were no restrictions on how I could use the money, no conditions I had to meet, and no requirements to involve anyone else in financial decisions. Mr. Morrison also handed me a sealed envelope that Grandma Eleanor had left specifically for me, with instructions that it should be given to me privately after I had learned about the inheritance. I opened it with shaking hands and read words that brought tears to my eyes and steel to my resolve. My dearest Amanda, the letter began in her familiar, elegant handwriting. If you are reading this letter, it means I am gone and you are learning about the gift I have left for you. But this money is not just an inheritance, sweet girl. It is your ticket to freedom from anyone who has ever made you feel small, worthless, or dependent on their approval for your survival and happiness. I have watched that husband of yours slowly and systematically destroy your confidence and self-worth for years. I have seen how he treats you when he thinks no one is watching, how he speaks about you to other people, and how he has convinced you that you need him to survive in the world. You do not need him, Amanda. You never needed him. You are intelligent, capable, strong, and worthy of genuine love and respect. Regardless of how much money you have in your bank account, the letter continued for 2 more pages filled with specific examples of my strengths and capabilities that Marcus had trained me to forget or discount. Grandma Eleanor had been paying attention to details I thought no one noticed, remembering conversations and achievements that had been dismissed or minimized. In my own mind, use this gift wisely and courageously, she wrote near the end of the letter. Do not let anyone else control it or make decisions about it for you. Build a life that makes you genuinely happy. Surround yourself with people who appreciate your true value. And never again allow someone to convince you that you are less than the extraordinary woman I have always known you to be. The letter was signed with her characteristic flourish and included a postscript that made me smile through my tears. If that husband of yours shows his true colors when he thinks the money's not available to benefit him personally, you will know exactly what kind of man you married and what your marriage has always meant to him. Trust your instincts, sweet Amanda. You are stronger and smarter than anyone, including yourself, has given you credit for reading her words. I realized that Grandma Eleanor had orchestrated this entire situation to give me not just financial independence, but the emotional clarity and strength to see my marriage for what it really was. She had known that Marcus would reveal his true nature once he believed the money was no longer going to be available. And she had trusted me to be strong enough to face that truth and act on it decisively. That evening, Marcus came home already, drunk and in a particularly foul mood. He had apparently had a difficult day at work, losing a major sale to a competitor, and was looking for someone to blame for his frustrations. You know what your fundamental problem is, Amanda? He slurred, as he opened another beer and glared at me across our living room. You have never had to face real consequences for being useless and incompetent, he continued. Everything in your life has been handed to you by other people, and now even that is falling apart because you cannot handle the most basic legal and financial processes that any competent adult should be able to manage. He continued his drunken rant while I prepared a late dinner, his words becoming more vicious and personal with each passing minute. You are exactly like your worthless, dysfunctional family, he said with deliberate cruelty. Your father abandoned you because you were too much trouble. Your mother ignores you because you are embarrassing and needy, and even your precious grandmother left you money you are too stupid to collect. Nobody actually wants you around because you drag everyone down to your level of failure and mediocrity. As I listened to his assessment of my family and my character, I felt something remarkable happening inside me. Instead of the familiar pain and self-doubt his words usually triggered, I felt a calm, clear certainty about what I needed to do. This was not the voice of someone who loved me or even cared about my well-being. This was the voice of someone who had been using me as an emotional punching bag for years. Someone who stayed with me only because I made him feel superior and powerful. The next morning, while Marcus was still sleeping off his hangover, I made a series of phone calls that would change my life forever. I called Patricia Williams, a divorce attorney whose name Mr. Morrison had recommended. I called Susan Chen, a financial advisor who specialized in helping people manage sudden wealth. I called Margaret Foster, a real estate agent who handled properties in neighborhoods I had always admired. And I called Rocky Mountain Moving, its company, to schedule an estimate for packing and relocating my personal belongings. The divorce attorney, Patricia Williams, listened carefully as I explained my situation without revealing the full extent of my inheritance. When I mentioned that I had recently inherited a substantial amount of money, her eyebrows rose slightly, but she remained professionally composed and focused on the legal aspects of my case. This is actually quite straightforward under Oregon law, she explained, since you inherited the money after your marriage. And since Oregon follows equitable distribution rather than community property rules, your husband has no legal claim to any portion of your inheritance. We can file for divorce on grounds of emotional abuse and have you legally separated within 90 days if he does not contest the proceedings. Over the next 2 weeks, I quietly assembled all the pieces for my new life while maintaining the pretense that nothing changed in our daily routine. I purchased a beautiful house in the Pearl District, a neighborhood I had always loved but never dreamed I could afford. I hired interior designers to furnish it according to my own taste, rather than Marcus's preferences. I opened new bank accounts at a different institution and transferred funds that would cover all my immediate expenses. I also hired Mitchell Investigation Services, a private detective agency, to document Marcus's behavior and conduct a thorough background check on his activities. What they discovered was both shocking and completely predictable given what I now understood about his character. Marcus had been having an affair with Jennifer Collins, a 25-year-old receptionist at his dealership, for over 8 months. The relationship had become serious enough that they were making plans to leave their respective spouses once Marcus had access to my inheritance money. Jennifer was apparently very impressed by Marcus's stories about the wealth he was about to acquire through marriage and was eager to start a new life, funded by my grandmother's generosity. The private investigator also uncovered Marcus's gambling problem, which explained why our personal finances had always been tighter than his income suggested. He had been hiding substantial debts from me for years, taking cash advances on credit cards I did not know existed and borrowing against his salary to cover losses at the casino and in underground poker games. His sudden intense interest in my inheritance was partly motivated by his desperate need to pay off creditors, who were becoming increasingly aggressive about collecting what he owed. Armed with this information, I felt completely justified in my decision to leave Marcus without warning or detailed explanation. On a Thursday morning, exactly 2 weeks after his worthless speech, I waited until he left for work, then supervised as professional movers packed my personal belongings and loaded them into trucks. I left divorce papers on the kitchen counter, along with a brief note that would be the last communication he would ever receive from me directly. Marcus. The note read in my clearest handwriting: I have filed for divorce based on emotional abuse, infidelity, and financial deception. My attorney will be in contact with you regarding legal proceedings. Do not attempt to contact me directly through any means. By the way, the inheritance was never contested or delayed. I have been worth $74 million since the day we met with the lawyer. Your reaction to thinking it was temporarily unavailable told me everything I needed to know about what our marriage has always meant to you. I signed it simply Amanda Richardson and left my wedding ring on top of the legal documents. By the time Marcus came home that evening, I was in my new house, sitting in a beautiful living room filled with furniture I had chosen myself, drinking wine from crystal glasses I had purchased because I liked them, not because they fit some. budget or decorating scheme Marcus had approved. My phone began ringing constantly that night. Marcus called dozens of times, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails that ranged from furious threats to pathetic bargaining to fake apologies. Clearly designed to manipulate me into coming back. He showed up at my grandmother's house, apparently, thinking I was staying there temporarily. And when he found it empty and listed for sale, he began calling everyone he could think of who might know my new location. What Marcus did not realize was that I had anticipated his reaction and taken comprehensive steps to protect myself from retaliation. The private investigator had documented his volatile behavior and drinking problems. The divorce attorney had already filed restraining orders that prohibited him from contacting me or coming within 500 feet of my home or workplace. I had hired executive protection services to monitor my new house and provide personal security if Marcus attempted to confront me directly. I was no longer the helpless, financially dependent woman he had married 8 years earlier. I was someone with substantial resources, excellent legal representation, professional security, and most importantly, the absolute certainty that I deserved better treatment than what he had given me. Throughout our marriage, the divorce proceedings were swift and decisive, partly because Marcus hired an inexperienced attorney who was clearly outmatched by Patricia Williams's expertise and preparation. Marcus attempted to claim half of my inheritance, arguing that we had made all major financial decisions as a married couple and that his emotional and financial support had enabled me to maintain the close relationship with my grandmother that led to the substantial bequest. His lawyer argued that the inheritance was a direct result of marital investment in family relationships and should therefore be considered community property subject to equitable distribution between spouses. They also claimed that Marcus had foregone other career opportunities in order to support my part-time work schedule and family obligations. My attorney demolished these arguments with methodical precision. She presented comprehensive evidence of Marcus's ongoing affair, concealed gambling debts, pattern of emotional abuse documented by the private investigator, and most damaging of all, the recorded conversations in which Marcus described me as worthless and admitted to friends that he was only staying married to me because of the money he expected to inherit when my grandmother died. In one particularly devastating recording, Marcus told a coworker that he was planning to divorce me as soon as my grandmother's estate was settled, taking half the inheritance and leaving me with nothing because I was too stupid and incompetent to fight him effectively. He described me as pathetic dead weight that he had been carrying for years, purely out of obligation. The judge was clearly disgusted by the evidence of Marcus's character and motivations. Not only did he receive no portion of my inheritance, but he was ordered to pay his own substantial legal fees and court costs. The restraining order was made permanent, prohibiting Marcus from contacting me through any means for the next 10 years. He was also required to attend anger management counseling and submit to regular alcohol testing as part of the divorce settlement. 6 months after leaving Marcus, I was living a life I had never imagined possible for someone like me. I had returned to school full-time to complete my bachelor's degree in business administration, something I had always wanted to do but never believed I was smart enough to achieve. My professors were impressed with my analytical thinking and work ethic, validating what Grandma Eleanor had always insisted about my intelligence and potential. I used a portion of my inheritance to establish the Amanda Richardson Foundation, a nonprofit organization that provided comprehensive support services to women leaving abusive marriages, working closely with domestic violence organizations throughout the Pacific Northwest. We helped women who lacked the financial resources to hire competent divorce attorneys, secure safe housing, or protect themselves from violent or vengeful former partners. The foundation also provided job training programs, educational scholarships, and counseling services to help women rebuild their sense of self-worth and independence after leaving destructive relationships. Within our first year of operation, we had assisted over 400 women in successfully escaping abusive situations and establishing stable, Independent lives. The work was incredibly rewarding both professionally and personally, but more than that, it connected me with other women who had experienced similar patterns of manipulation and control. I discovered that Marcus's gradual erosion of my confidence and independence was remarkably common, and that many intelligent, capable women had found themselves in situations where they had been convinced they were worthless and completely dependent on abusive partners. Through the foundation, I met Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a psychologist who specialized in helping abuse survivors reclaim their sense of identity and self-worth. She became both a professional mentor and a close personal friend, helping me understand the psychological dynamics that had made me vulnerable to Marcus's manipulation and teaching me to recognize and trust my own strength and judgment. I also reconnected with college friends I had lost touch with during my marriage. Relationships Marcus had subtly discouraged because he preferred me isolated, dependent on him for social connection and emotional support. These women welcomed me back into their lives warmly and admitted they had been concerned about changes they had noticed in my personality and confidence over the years, but had not known how to address their worries without seeming intrusive or judgmental. Perhaps most surprisingly, my inheritance opened doors to relationships with extended family members I had barely known before Grandma Eleanor's death. Several of her longtime friends and neighbors reached out to share memories and stories that helped me understand the remarkable woman who had saved my life in ways that went far beyond financial security. I learned that Grandma Eleanor had been a pioneering businesswoman during the 1960s and 70s, building successful real estate investments at a time when few women were involved in commercial property development. She had accumulated her wealth through decades of careful research, strategic planning, and an entrepreneurial spirit that no one in our family had fully understood or appreciated. Her decision to live modestly had not been about frugality or necessity, but about finding satisfaction in simple pleasures while ensuring her money would be available to help family members when they truly needed support and opportunity. She had been quietly observing all of her children and grandchildren for years, waiting to see who would demonstrate genuine character and values worthy of inheriting the responsibility that came with substantial wealth. 1 year after my divorce was finalized, I received an unexpected letter forwarded through my attorney's office. Marcus was writing from a residential treatment facility where he was receiving help for gambling addiction, alcohol dependency, and what his counselors had identified as narcissistic personality disorder with abusive tendencies. The letter was a lengthy apology acknowledging the emotional damage he had caused throughout our marriage and accepting full responsibility for the failure of our relationship. He described the therapy he was receiving, the insights he was gaining about his behavior patterns, and his commitment to becoming a better person regardless of whether I ever forgave him. I read the letter carefully, then wrote a brief response that I sent through my attorney. I appreciate that you are working to address your problems and take responsibility for your actions, I wrote. However, I am not interested in rebuilding any kind of relationship with you now or in the future. I wish you success in your recovery process, but my life has moved forward completely, and I have no desire to revisit our past together for any reason. It was perhaps the most direct and confident communication I had ever sent to Marcus, reflecting how dramatically I had changed in the months since discovering my own strength and worth. The woman who had once apologized for having opinions now felt completely comfortable setting clear boundaries with someone who had spent years trying to control and diminish her. 2 years after my divorce, completed my bachelor's degree summa cum laude, was accepted into the MBA program at Portland State University with a full academic scholarship I had earned through my own merit. My professors encouraged me to consider pursuing a doctorate in business administration, suggesting that my combination of academic excellence and real-world experience with nonprofit management made me an ideal candidate for advanced study. I also began dating again, something I had not believed would be possible during the darkest years of my marriage to Marcus. The foundation work had introduced me to David Chen, a social worker who managed programs for at-risk youth in East Portland. He was kind, genuinely respectful, and seemed authentically interested in my thoughts and opinions rather than trying to correct or improve them. More importantly, David encouraged my professional and academic goals, celebrating my successes rather than feeling threatened by my achievements or independence. When I told him about my inheritance early in our relationship, his response was supportive rather than calculating. He had his own career that he was passionate about, his own financial stability, and his own sense of self-worth that did not depend on controlling or diminishing anyone else. When I eventually shared the details of my marriage to Marcus and the emotional abuse I had endured for so many years, David's response was gentle support and admiration for my strength in leaving rather than judgment or pity. He helped me recognize patterns of behavior that I should watch for in future relationships. And he consistently demonstrated through his actions that healthy partnerships were built on mutual respect and encouragement. 3 years after my divorce, I felt like a completely transformed person from the woman who had sat in that lawyer's office. Learning about her unexpected inheritance, I was confident in my own judgment, professionally successful in meaningful work, surrounded by genuine friendships with people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide, and in a loving relationship with someone who appreciated my intelligence and independence. But the most important change was internal and psychological. I had learned to trust my own instincts to set appropriate boundaries with people who tried to manipulate or control me, and to recognize my inherent worth regardless of external circumstances or other people's opinions. Marcus had spent 8 years systematically convincing me that I was worthless and dependent. But Grandma Eleanor's gift had given me the freedom and resources to discover that his assessment was not just wrong, it was deliberately destructive. The money had certainly changed my life in obvious practical ways. I lived in a beautiful home that reflected my own taste and values, could pursue educational opportunities without financial stress, and had the resources to help hundreds of other women escape situations similar to what I had endured. But the real transformation had been emotional and spiritual. I had discovered that I was worthy of respect, love, and happiness, and that anyone who tried to convince me otherwise was someone who did not deserve a place in my life. Looking back with the clarity that distance and healing provide, I realized that Marcus had been revealing his true character throughout our entire marriage, not just during that final cruel Thursday evening. The signs had been there for years, growing progressively worse as he became more confident in his control over me. His subtle but constant criticism, his efforts to isolate me from family and friends, his need to control every decision both large and small, his complete lack of interest in my goals and dreams unless they somehow served his purposes. Grandma Eleanor had recognized these patterns clearly, which was why her inheritance came with much more than money. It came with the wisdom to understand emotional abuse, the resources to escape it safely, and most importantly, the knowledge that I possessed, the strength and intelligence to rebuild my life according to my own values and desires. She had understood that financial independence was meaningless without the emotional courage and self-confidence to use it wisely. Her letter had not just given me permission to leave Marcus, it had reminded me of who I really was beneath the layers of criticism and control that had accumulated over 8 years of psychological manipulation. The foundation continued to grow and expand our services throughout the Pacific Northwest. We now operated programs in Washington, Oregon, and Northern California, providing comprehensive support to women leaving abusive relationships. Our services included emergency housing, legal assistance, job training, educational scholarships, counseling, and long-term mentoring to help women establish truly independent lives. Every woman who walked through our doors reminded me of something crucial about human worth and resilience. Strength is not measured by how much abuse you can endure silently, but by your courage to recognize that you deserve better and your willingness to take action to create change. Intelligence is not diminished by someone else's need to feel superior, and confidence can be rebuilt. Even after years of systematic destruction, we had helped over 1,500 women successfully leave abusive situations and establish stable, independent lives. Many had gone on to complete educational programs, start successful businesses, build healthy relationships, and develop the kind of self-confidence I wished I had discovered earlier in my own life. Their success stories reminded me daily that Grandma Eleanor's investment in my freedom, it created ripple effects that extended far beyond my personal situation. Marcus had been wrong about me being worthless and incapable. But he had been accidentally correct about one thing. I did not need him to survive, succeed, or find happiness. I never had needed him. I had simply been convinced through years of careful manipulation that I was dependent on his approval and support for everything meaningful in my life. Today, I am 35 years old, happily engaged to David, and running both my MBA program and the foundation that has become my life's work. I still visit Grandma Eleanor's grave regularly, updating her on my progress and thanking her for the extraordinary gift she gave me, not just the financial inheritance. Though that certainly provided the practical means for transformation, the real gift was the opportunity to discover who I truly was when I was free from someone else's cruel and deliberate assessment of my worth. Marcus had been wrong about me in every possible way, and Grandma Eleanor had trusted me to figure that out for myself when I was given the resources and freedom to do so. I recently received a letter from Jennifer Collins, Marcus's former affair partner, who had apparently married him after our divorce was finalized. She was writing to ask for advice about leaving her own abusive marriage. Having discovered that Marcus's treatment of me had not been an anomaly, but a consistent pattern he brought to every relationship, I provided her with information about legal resources and support services. But I also told her something that I wished someone had told me years earlier. Your worth as a human being is not determined by someone else's opinion of you, no matter how loudly or frequently they express that opinion. The person who truly loves you will want to see you succeed, grow, and become the best version of yourself. Not convince you that you are fortunate to have someone willing to tolerate your supposed inadequacies. Jennifer thanked me and began the process of leaving Marcus, using some of the same legal and support resources that had helped me establish my independence. The foundation provided her with temporary housing and job placement assistance, demonstrating how Grandma Eleanor's original gift continued to create positive change in ways she could never have anticipated. 6 months ago, I was invited to speak at the National Conference on Domestic Violence Prevention, sharing my story with advocates, counselors, and survivors from across the country. Standing at that podium, looking out at an audience of people dedicated to helping others escape abusive situations, I felt the full impact of how dramatically my life had changed. The woman who had once apologized for having opinions was now speaking confidently to hundreds of professionals about the psychological dynamics of emotional abuse and the importance of financial independence in enabling women to leave dangerous relationships. The transformation was not just personal. It had become a platform for helping others recognize their own strength and worth. During the question and answer session after my presentation, a young woman raised her hand and asked, "How did you find the courage to leave when you had been convinced for so many years that you were worthless and dependent?" Her question took me back to that Thursday evening when Marcus had delivered his final cruel assessment of my character and value. The courage came from finally understanding the difference between someone else's opinion of me and the truth about who I really was. I told her, when someone who claims to love you consistently makes you feel smaller, weaker, and less capable, that says everything about their character and nothing about yours. Real love builds you up, supports your growth, and celebrates your successes. Anything else is not love, regardless of what someone calls it. After the conference, David and I drove to the coast for a long weekend, something we had been planning for months. as we walked along the beach on Sunday morning, watching the sunrise over the Pacific Ocean. I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this peaceful moment, from the shock of learning about my inheritance to the pain of recognizing my marriage for what it really was, to the satisfaction of building something meaningful with the resources I had been given. Every step had been necessary for my growth and understanding. The money had changed my life, but not in the ways I had initially feared or expected. It had not corrupted my values or isolated me from authentic relationships. Instead, it had given me the freedom to see clearly, choose wisely, and become the person I was always capable of being when I was not being systematically diminished by someone who benefited from my lack of confidence. The most valuable lesson I learned was not about wealth or marriage or family dynamics. It was about the difference between external validation and internal worth. For years, I had allowed Marcus to define my value through his criticism and control, believing that his assessment of my capabilities was more accurate than my own experience of my intelligence and strength. Grandma Eleanor's gift had taught me that worth comes from within, from your actions and choices and character, not from someone else's willingness to approve of you. The people who deserve a place in your life are those who see your value clearly and want to help you become the best version of yourself, not those who need you to remain small and dependent in order to feel powerful and important themselves. David squeezed my hand as we walked, bringing me back to the present moment. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" he asked with the gentle curiosity that characterized all of our conversations. Just how different everything could have been. I replied, if Grandma Eleanor had not left me that inheritance, if she had not given me the resources to discover who Marcus really was, I might have spent the rest of my life believing his assessment of my worth and capabilities. But she did leave it to you, Kay said simply, and you had the courage to use it wisely. That says everything about who you really are, regardless of what anyone else ever told you about yourself. As we continued walking along the shoreline, I thought about all the women who had passed through the Foundations programs, each one discovering her own strength and worth, after years of being convinced she was powerless and dependent. Their transformations reminded me that what had happened to me was not unique or special, except in the specific circumstances that had made change possible. Everyone deserves the chance to discover their authentic self, free from the manipulation and control of people who benefit from keeping others diminished and dependent. Not everyone has the advantage of sudden wealth to provide that opportunity, but everyone has the inherent right to respect, dignity, and the chance to grow into their full potential. The Foundation's work had taught me that healing and transformation were possible regardless of how long someone had endured abuse or how deeply their self-confidence had been damaged. With the right support, resources, and encouragement, women who had been convinced they were worthless could rediscover their intelligence, strengths, and capability in remarkably short periods of time. That was perhaps the most important legacy of Grandma Eleanor's gift. Not just my personal transformation, but the demonstration that change was possible for anyone willing to take the difficult steps necessary to leave destructive situations and rebuild their lives according to their own values and dreams. Marcus had told me I was worthless and would never amount to anything without him. He was wrong on both counts, spectacularly and completely wrong. But his cruelty had served one useful purpose. It had shown me exactly what I was escaping from, and why that escape was not just justified, but absolutely necessary for my survival and growth. Today, surrounded by meaningful work, genuine relationships, and the knowledge that I am capable of far more than I ever imagined during those dark years of my marriage, I understand the true value of Grandma Eleanor's final gift. She had not just given me money, she had given me the freedom to become myself, fully and authentically, without apology or compromise. Have you ever been in a relationship where someone tried to convince you that you were less capable or valuable than you really were? You find the strength to trust your own judgment over their criticism. What signs should people watch for when someone claims to love them, but consistently makes them feel smaller and less confident? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might help someone else recognize their own situation and find the courage to make necessary changes. If this story resonated with you, please hit like and subscribe to hear more real stories about finding, strengthen difficult relationships, and discovering your authentic worth. Remember to share this with someone who might need to hear that their value is not determined by someone else's opinion, no matter how convincingly that opinion is presented. Thank you for listening, and remember that you are stronger, smarter, and more valuable than anyone who tries to diminish you could ever understand or acknowledge.